We hadn't always been here, but the neighborhood has. Even before it was a neighborhood on Earth, this one had always been here. Here for those that would be lost on these cursed grounds. Here for those who would die long before their real life ever truly began. Here for those who would never really want it to grow up. We come from different times, and we come from different lives. But one thing remains true of all of us. We lived on the earthly realm of the neighborhood at some point in our lives, and died before our time was supposed to come. We don't remember much of our lives in the cul-de-sac since the last member of our group joined us, and we certainly won't remember when the next spirit comes. But here's what we do know. Rolf was the first to come here. Unlike most of us, he was born in far-off lands, and even in the afterlife hasn't lost touch with his old world upbringing. He lived in the neighborhood before it was developed, the son of a shepherd. He and the rest of his family came to start a farm on the lands that would soon turn into the place we would all eventually reside in. He was proud of his heritage and respected his ancestors. He died in 1903, while he was on his way to town to buy farming supplies. He was shot and murdered by a hate group against immigrants. He continues to go about the farm business on a daily basis in the afterlife, but he is more than happy to occasionally neglect his livestock to play with the other children of the neighborhood. Johnny was always the lonely child. In fact, Rolf actually became his first human friend ever when he came to the cul-de-sac after his death. His parents moved on to the grounds of Rolf's former farm not long after his death. With no children around, and no field work to take up his time, as it did Rolf's, Johnny drew into his own mind. From this, Plank was born. Together, they wandered the countryside, climbing trees and getting themselves in trouble. Sadly, this didn't last forever. In 1922, the Ku Klux Klan set his house on fire, burning it down to the ground. His family managed to escape, but unfortunately, Johnny didn't. He saw his imaginary friend, Plank, standing by him to his last breaths. Even in the afterlife without the countryside to play in, Johnny still wastes much of his time frolicking through the backyards and streets. Eddy was the next to come. Eddy was born in New York City, but moved to the neighborhood in 1932, just as the Great Depression was hitting its full swing. The neighborhood, while still different, was beginning to take form from the fields of its past families moved in, and split up the lands that had once belonged to Rolf's family. Always a schemer, Eddy looked to do anything to bring some comfort to his very bare family life, even if it cost him the friendship of others. Eddy also never had a father figure, since his real dad abandoned him and his mother when he was first born. From this, Eddy's brother was created. Even though he was nothing more than a figment of Eddy's imagination, Eddy looked up to him. Eddy died in 1939 after one of his great plans to swindle a sap backfired. He drowned while trying to cross the local river after trying to run away from the angry kids that he tried to deceive. Even in the afterlife, he continues to chase after the almighty dollar. Sarah and Ed came together not too long after that. By the late 1940s, the cul-de-sac had already nearly taken its final form as one of the pre-planned developments that became popular in the post-war era. As brother and sister, growing up in the chaos of World War II, they both had various ways of escaping their lives as children of a GI and a hard-working mother. Sarah became enraged and controlling as she sought to make sure that everyone around her knew that she was in charge, all in an attempt to copy off her view of the hustle and bustle of her often working mother. Ed, on the other hand, went about it in a completely different way. He just shut it out entirely. In fact, he shut out nearly everyone and everything in the world, entirely becoming what appeared to be a complete idiot. Ed chose instead to become completely involved in the monster movies and comic books that began to pop up after the war had ended. When their father finally came back from fighting in World War II, he had gone insane from the horrifying memories on the battlefield. He would beat his wife and abuse Sarah and Ed. Eventually, Ed, Sarah, and their mother left their insane father and fled to the cul-de-sac in Peach Creek. Their father was still responsible for paying child support for Ed and Sarah, but since he couldn't find a good-paying job at all, he could barely afford it. He then decided to track them down and murder them. It wasn't too long that he found them in Peach Creek. On a warm summer afternoon in 1953, Ed's father found Sarah playing at the neighborhood playground. He tried to kill her, but Ed intervened and sacrificed himself to save his little sister. Sarah was emotionally shattered by the loss of her only brother. She eventually blamed him for his own death and developed a deep rage for him. 2 months later, after Ed's death, his father came back to the playground Sarah was playing at that day. That time, she didn't survive. Even in the afterlife, Sarah still holds a deep rage against Ed for abandoning her, and Ed still does whatever he can to earn her forgiveness. Nass came a time after the brother and sister. She was a flower child born to a pair of hippies during the establishment in the late 60s. She was a naturally beautiful girl that always had a way with boys and men alike. She lived life on a whim, and often went about flirting and playing without any intentions. She died in possibly the most horrible way of any of the children in the neighborhood. In August of 1979, a serial killer had broke out of the local asylum. He slipped into her house in the dead of the night while she was having a sleepover with her friends. He tied up her friends and left them unharmed. Then he kidnapped Nass. Her family and friends searched desperately for her. The whole neighborhood pitched in, and numerous investigators trying to find out what happened to her. Unfortunately, she would never come home alive. In October of 1979, her body was found near the gag factory in Lemonbrook. She was tortured to death and murdered. The man who did it was found a short time after that and was executed in 1982. In the trauma of these events, she, in a way similar to Ed, shut out the world entirely and forgot of her parents and siblings, which is why in the afterlife she doesn't receive demands from the non-existent parents, unlike many of the others. This gives her more time to lounge around and party, as she often did. It didn't take long before Double D joined the rest of the neighborhood. He was the child of two highly controlling professionals. Despite their constant absence, they dominated his life. As such, Ed became quite the intellectual and a rather meek and shy figure. Always the curious type, he loved to experiment, and when given the time away from school and the constant chores of his parents, he was also never into sports, and was often uninterested in physical activity. He died at school in 1985 during a dodgeball game. During the game, one of his classmates threw a ball so hard at him that it knocked him unconscious. When he landed on the ground, his skull cracked open. He fell into a deep coma and died at the hospital a few days later. In the afterlife, he wears a hat to hide the scar of his injury that led him to his untimely death. He also continued to follow the written orders of his parents long after his death. He never forgot about his fear of dodgeball either. Kevin was next to join the group. He was born on the day of Double D's death, and he was the complete opposite of Double D too. Kevin came from a broken home and developed a bold personality. In his life, he was always angry and took it out on the other children. His abusive father would rarely pay him any attention in life, and would end up bringing about the end of it. In a drunken rage, his father beat him and stabbed him to death after Kevin attempted to stand up to him. He died on the way to the hospital in the winter of 1999. His father spent the rest of his life in prison. In the afterlife, Kevin's changed his perception to the opposite of what his life really was, with a distant father who would shower him with gifts. However, he continued to maintain his bullying, even in death. Jimmy was the next to come to the cul-de-sac. He never had a father figure and was raised by his overly caring mother. This caused him to develop a very feminine personality. He was constantly teased at school for it. People would judge him on the way he talked, the way he dressed, and the way he acted. He was also very passive and was an easy target for the local bullies at his school. Every day he'd come home with bruises and injuries. When his mother confronted the school about it, they never took any action at all. The torment dragged on for years, and eventually, Jimmy caved into his own suffering. He committed suicide on April 16, 2000, by overdosing on Tylenol. In the aftermath of his death, his mother won a lawsuit against Peach Creek Junior High for not doing anything about the bullying that caused her son's death. The Canker Sisters were different from the spirits of the cul-de-sac. They were never of the earthly plane of existence. Instead, they were children of demons. They seemed to possess abilities impossible by the standards of the others, such as the ability to appear nearly anywhere instantly. They were sent from hell to torment the already tortured souls of the neighborhood. Surprisingly, they are attracted to the Eds for unknown reasons. Although it is speculated that they are the weakest-willed members of the neighborhood and are seen as easy targets by them. Despite that, they are universally loathed and often feared by everyone, including the Eds. But there is only one spirit that doesn't fear them. You may not recognize this character, but he is among the spirits of the cul-de-sac. Although he never appeared in any of the episodes, due to the fact, by the time he died, Eddy and Eddy already completed its series run in 2009. His name is Joe. Even though his death wasn't as terrifying as Nass's was, his life was much more terrifying than any of the children in the cul-de-sac. Joe was a foster child, born in a juvenile prison in Texas in the late 1990s. His parents were deported to Mexico, and he was raised by a foster family, living in a rundown apartment in downtown San Antonio. The environment he grew up in was dangerous and unstable. The city was full of gang members, thieves, criminals, and the cops were all corrupted. When Joe was just 7 years old, he was forced to join a local gang, Vados. Every day was a nightmare for him. He lived in constant fear and was always paranoid. He was always at risk of getting killed, and the Vados gang forced him to participate in their crimes and to kill many innocent civilians. Joe was driven to a deep insanity. After a few years, he was sent to live with a new foster family who resided in the cul-de-sac in Peach Creek. The cul-de-sac had finally taken its final form in the late 2000s decade. His new foster family tried to help him, but there was no help for him at all. Joe had already lost his sanity. He was haunted by the terrifying memories of being part of the Vados gang. He would often awake in the middle of the night, screaming, and he'd constantly have mental breakdowns. Eventually, his foster family decided that they couldn't take it. In December 2012, on his 16th birthday, he He was kicked out of his foster parents' home. It just so happens that the court had him emancipated against his will. He would no longer receive help from anyone, and he was on his own completely. On the cold winter night of New Year's Eve 2012, he died of hypothermia. He spent the final hours of his life in the trailer park, surrounded by the spirits of the cul-de-sac who came before him. All of them were waiting. Jimmy, Nass, Sarah, Johnny, Ed, Eddy, all of them were waiting for him to join them.